members, for the wrap-up of this bill and the series of bills, the chair recognizes the Right Honorable Member for Centerville.
Mr. Speaker, I'm privileged to stand to be the final speaker in this debate. By way of summing up, I'm going to make a very, very substantial speech. It's going to take a considerable period of time, but it will answer, I hope, every point that has been made in this debate. And the predicate of it, sir, is that no matter who governed this country, Hubert Ingram knew, Zavago Lang knew, I know, the Minister of State for Finance know, that we were on a course where it would have been impossible to avoid bringing legislation like this to Parliament. That can be the predicate throughout my speech. And Mr. Speaker, the Bahamas is in the world. And let me just say, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to talk about some points and leave the substantive speech to when I come back. But I want to make some points. Firstly, sir, I have been in public life for a very long time. During the process, I have been instrumental in facilitating many persons coming into public life for the first time. I've done so on the basis of my judgment on what I think would be right for the Progressive Liberal Party and right for the country. Sometimes we make mistakes, Mr. Speaker. Sometimes we make mistakes. But in our democracy, Mr. Speaker, I may have been subjected in my past to the exercise of power that resulted in my not getting a nomination. And by the grace of God, I had the political base to be able to run as an independent, supported by the FNM, who did not run a candidate, by Cecil Wallace Whitfield. And it enabled me to win. And therefore to have a continuous place in this Parliament. When people on my side, in the process of governance, disagrees fundamentally with me, they have a choice. Firstly, to recognize that the Progressive Liberal Party operates on a revolving door. The door swings in and it swings out. So you are free at all times, Mr. Speaker, to stay or to go. There's no problem with me and my leadership in that regard. Secondly, I do not propose, Mr. Speaker, ever, to engage as leader of the Progressive Liberal Party in a debate in Parliament with anyone who could have discussions with me prior to my coming here and settle the matters one way or the other, to disagree and come in here and disagree, or to agree. I do not propose to engage any such person forever and forever and forever if it is left to me. With respect to this bill, the set of bills before us, I also claim to have been chairman of the gaming board and for a significant period of time. Then it was a board, Mr. Speaker, that was wanting insofar as the law it had to administer. The occasion came where the Honorable Lady Hannah, as minister responsible for gaming, agreed with the recommendation that my board made to bring in the United Kingdom, gaming board, who brought with them an accounting firm by the name of Dixon, Wilson and Co., for us to elevate gaming investigations and place it squarely on the basis of integrity and accountability. Thereafter, those who followed me, including the Honorable Bradley Roberts, enhanced that process to the point where the minister, when he stood to his feet and said that he was minister of a gaming jurisdiction that was respected by the world, was right. Mr. Speaker, with respect to the tourist industry, I had the occasion, Mr. Speaker, to say to web shop operators, on one meeting that I was at, that whether we like it or not, the casinos in the Bahamas have a history of not making money. Yes, the member for Long Island was correct in saying that when they started, they were to be a part of an offering, therefore supplementing the rooms being sold. But Atlantis would probably be, to date, the only casino that was making some money, but even so, when it amortized it over the whole business, it was challenged. The point was made that this bill is different because it has eliminated the Hotel Corporation of the Bahamas as the owner of casinos. The Lotteries and Gaming Act, as it is now, deems the Hotel Corporation to be the exclusive owner of gaming premises in the Bahamas. It is a fiction in terms of the law and in terms of practice, and I recommend it strongly to my colleagues, we do not proceed any further with the fiction. And just as a matter of interest, the former government, through those who made the decisions, also have the same point of view. Even if this leader of the opposition do not know. A fiction because, Mr. Speaker, the law says we own the casinos. That is the Hotel Corporation of the Bahamas. So Atlantis then has to subcontract or lease their premises to the Hotel Corporation. And the Hotel Corporation subleases it back to Atlantis, and so therefore we've made it that. And likewise all of the way through. We could not get, in this new area, the Hotel Corporation involved in gaming rooms and gaming houses in that way. The fiction had to come to an end. And the emphasis placed on the regulatory body. And I'll speak to that all day. With respect to, Mr. Speaker, this issue, the Minister of Tourism, that is the Member of Parliament for West End and Bimini, presented excerpts from the business supplement of the Nassau Guardian of a man by the name of Stephen Thompson. And we didn't pay any attention to it. These excerpts, Mr. Speaker, speaks to a process which would tell this country, you have no choice. And I'll refer to that article. You have no choice but to regulate. And I will argue it, and I hope it will be understood. But, Mr. Speaker, we had a referendum that originated in our platform promise. The leader of the opposition called me a lot of things, a lot of personal things. I've had the opportunity, thank God, to reflect on who I am and how I should respond to him. Because I'm confident I could hurt him with the same degree of personal attacks. No threat, not at all. No threat. But I have decided, Mr. Speaker, that I'm going to stay away from anything personal in this debate. Period, full stop. Because, Mr. Speaker, in part, all of the imperfections that I may have as a person, it is always difficult, Mr. Speaker, when someone questions your bona fides, your good faith, your commitment to govern honestly, and whether it's web shop operators or NIGAD or whoever they are, that this person who's been in this parliament for all these years, generations, who now have the privilege of being the longest serving member sitting in this house, I guess you could say father of the house, would allow himself to be used by any of those persons whose names were called or referred to in here. How is it that I could have been this long, winning 8 consecutive elections, not owning a share in a company, not investing in one, probably stupid to do so, but avoiding at all times the arguments of conflict? And I'm going, Mr. Speaker, to speak to my friends in the church. Mr. Speaker, when the editorials and those who editorialize speak about whether I'm going to run again or I'm going to run again, I have reason to tell them, Mr. Speaker, that I'm thanking God every day for the fact that I'm alive. Pinling did not live to be this old. I'm thanking God, Mr. Speaker, that if he gives me the opportunity to live as long as my mother, I only have 9 years to live, and they're talking about what I'm going to do. And that's why I'm personally disappointed in the member for Charlotte. Because he knows the confidence I have in him. He knows the confidence I have in his ability. His mother knows the confidence I have in his ability. He knows the extent to which I personally am responsible for his nomination. He knows that. I don't take away from him his right to speak. I don't want to. It's not my style. But just allow me, Mr. Speaker, to be who I am. In all my perfections, to allow me to be who I am. I say it to my friends of the church. I heard the members that he would speak to John 3:16. When I went to East Street Gospel Hall, that's what they taught me. That's what they taught me. And as I got older and I got to understand more the wording of it, that's where my faith came in. And every time I get up in a church, I remind myself of my own imperfections and speak to the need for me to be a person of faith. And I personalize it. To all of you, I personalize it. I say, I want to see my mommy again. I've said it all over this country, every church all over this country. I told them, Mr. Speaker, I wrestled with God. I told the Pope that. And you know, you may laugh. But when my wife and I had an autistic child, I saw the manifestations of that child, I said, what is the purpose of giving us someone who will be trapped in a man's body? Mr. Speaker, that is what faith, and you wrestle with faith, that is what you do in the quietude, and you speak it aloud. I know the Bible. I know its reliance on lean not on your own understanding, in terms of human understanding. I know that. But, Mr. Speaker, am I not at liberty to ask, my God, why is it that the most decent man I know would spend all his life paying rent and never once have the privilege to own a house? I said, God, tell me why. Because God works through people, and maybe in my time we will be able to do something about it. Do you think, Mr. Speaker, when in all my time in public life, the results of the referendum came out and I said we will honor it? I then ordered the web shops closed and they appealed it. They injuncted it. It was then, Mr. Speaker, that I met with the governor. It's then that I spoke to the governor. It's then that I spoke to the Royal Bank of Canada. Mr. Speaker, the conversations are continuing. Let me tell you, Mr. Speaker, you see in today's press where the governor of the central bank says she is studying the regulations and the law. So should she. Because people seem not to understand the power of that position she occupies. You only need to read the Central Bank Act to see, Mr. Speaker, if the governor whispers for you that something is irregular, then you had better pay attention to it. And I will tell you during the course of today why. I met with the Royal Bank of Canada again on Thursday. The leadership of the bank from Toronto with Bahamians present here and others. You would have recalled some headline to the effect that Royal Bank says they would not take money from interactive gaming. The bank, through its leadership, told me, Mr. Speaker, that they recognize they are in partnership with the government of the Bahamas. They're the government's banker. And in today's global uncertainties, they wanted to signal up front what the standards of any legislation and any regulation should be. And that the door is not closed for them because they now have their compliance section of the Royal Bank of Canada analyzing, like the governor of the central bank, the regulations and legislation. Mr. Speaker, I will tell you during the course of today that the Bahamas government, later this month, will have to entertain an investigation from a body of the Organization of American States, and I will refer specifically to it, that deals with a convention, anti-corruption convention we signed. That they will come in to look at the economy of the Bahamas. Obviously, we have an obligation to point out the vulnerable areas. And they will assess it. These agencies that come in speak to the government and speak to the opposition. They don't come back and say the opposition jokey or the government jokey to them. They speak and they draw their own conclusions. But they judge an opposition. But knowing that they're not the government, they hold their judgment in abeyance. Mr. Speaker, The article that the minister, when he was making the presentation responsible for gaming, point out, goes on to describe the risk that this country faces. And then it speaks to the fact that the overall judgment will be exercised when this country undergoes a national risk assessment in November 2015. He speaks in his article to that. But, Mr. Speaker, as early as tomorrow, I would ordinarily not say this, but as early as tomorrow, I will invite my colleagues to agree to the government retaining the World Bank to lead that assessment, either the IMF or the World Bank. The IMF has difficulties in scheduling. Because, Mr. Speaker, between now and November, this country is going to have to show it got it right. And this article sets it out because the person who is talking, Stephen Thompson, the recently appointed National Coordinator for the National Anti-Money Laundering Task Force. Mr. Speaker, we became the deputy chair of the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force, and we took the chair. What it means, Mr. Speaker, is that when the referendum was held and the web shops got their injunction and placed it in the court, the entire world became aware of what the governor of the central bank brought to our attention, that there was an underground banking order developing. One should read the Central Bank Act to see the implications of that. The governor didn't have to say, do this or do that. Her job was to bring to the attention of the relevant authorities in the government a situation that was dangerous, which backed up by the Royal Bank of Canada when I spoke to them. Mr. Speaker, when I advised my colleagues, I told them at the same time I was meeting with the church, Mr. Speaker, whatever one wants to say about it, I know, Mr. Speaker, what my duties are. I know, I believe, how to carry out my responsibilities. And I knew, Mr. Speaker, that having taken the public position I took on web shops and gambling in the referendum and post-referendum, that I had to consult the church. And my consultations were deep and strong. I remember the lady minister, who is an executive of the Christian Council, Baptist minister, asking me what I think I have to do to change the position of the referendum, meaning any actions I would like to take. And I told her that I was searching for a new moral authority. My words. A new moral authority. That's what I was searching for, I told her. Because I had ministers of religion who had taken positions, Mr. Speaker, courageously so, before the referendum, during the referendum, after the referendum, that differs to the position some of their colleagues now take. I met with the leaders, Mr. Speaker, of churches, whether Catholic, Anglican, Seventh-day Adventist, Pentecostal, Baptist, Christian Council, and I openly and honestly discussed this matter. I told them what my fears were and invited them, if they wished, to consult people like the governor of the central bank. Mr. Speaker, from a personal point of view, we have people in our midst, Mr. Speaker, who are Christians, whose faith is no different to that of the Reverend Stewart or the Reverend Lyle Bethel, whose faith, who wants to have the same outcome and result for the people of our country as they want. It's important, Mr. Speaker, therefore, as we debate and discuss these matters, not to attribute to one side sin, corrupt practices, when they are motivated to do, Mr. Speaker, what all of the agencies of the world would reasonably expect them to do in the circumstances. Mr. Speaker, Stephen Thompson said in October 29th, the Nassau Guardian reported of 2013, that a National Anti-Money Laundering Task Force was appointed. He said that the numbers industry must be a part of a forthcoming national risk assessment that will see the government liaise with all financial industries in the country to determine areas that are vulnerable to this. Discussions have already begun concerning the regulation of the numbers industry, including which body would be the regulator. That's discussions by them, the regulators. So they know. I believe in the next 6 to 12 months, the determination would have to be made on sectors like this. I believe would have to be made. And he says, Mr. Speaker, fostering growth, transparency, and social responsibility comes as the Bahamas faces in 2015 a more thorough external review by CFATF than it has ever faced before. A review as to risks and areas of vulnerability in our economy. No government faced with the information this government was faced with, Mr. Speaker, could arrogate unto itself the right to say, let's ignore that. This now, Mr. Speaker, becomes a major matter for the Minister of Finance and Prime Minister of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. So that's me. And the question is, how best to deal with it? Because the consequences, Mr. Speaker, are too profoundly negative to risk being confronted by it or by them. They say that, Mr. Speaker, the fact that the Bahamas assumed the deputy chairmanship of this body in November 2012 makes compliance with its 40 recent recommendations on clamping down on this crime all the more compelling. Mr. Speaker, he goes on, Mr. Speaker, to talk about not wanting to preempt the work of the national coordination. But he says, I suspect, and I believe most people in here suspect that any time you have an unregulated sector which is generating huge sums of monies on a daily basis, the only responsible thing to do is to look at that sector and determine how do we manage this process. How do we bring it under the regulatory regime? Mr. Speaker, we know that this year we're going to be looked at, and we know that next year we're going to be looked at. So without speaking to sources of revenue, without speaking to jobs, without speaking to that issue, Mr. Speaker, my government decided that it had better take the steps towards ensuring that this industry is properly regulated. We did so, Mr. Speaker, on the basis that even on casinos, the CFATF had asked a question that we will have to answer. And yes, we combined the legislation so that we could have one bill on gaming, Mr. Speaker. And we did so, Mr. Speaker, on the premise that even in the referendum, the commitment was to regulate what exists. That's what it was about. To regulate what exists. But, Mr. Speaker, we have existing heads of agreement. I'm not going to go into the details of those heads of agreements, but we were satisfied that we had some real issues if we tried to tackle, as some would want us to, all of the issues at the same time. So we made a decision as the government of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas that we would proceed on the basis of improving the regime for casinos in the Bahamas to make those casinos more competitive, while at the same time we would move to regulate and make lawful the existence of web shops under the most stringent conditions. And I will be laying before you a request for proposal that will be set out, which some of them may not be able to meet the requirements of. Because the remit to those who advised us that we want the strongest regulatory administration we could possibly have, that we are prepared to dedicate resources to make it an extraordinary one in its enforcement, that we're prepared, if necessary, to bring in consultants to facilitate the transition from one regime to the next, one act to the next. But we will spare no resources, Mr. Speaker, in ensuring that when we are finished, we have complied with all the rules of integrity that the Financial Action Task Force would want, and all the rules that the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force would want. This question about what the AG got, Mr. Speaker, was never that. What the Attorney General had to do was to advise those bodies of what our government was doing, and those bodies would wait for the legislation. And like the governor of the central bank, like all of those who are reviewing, the Royal Bank of Canada, the FATF, and the CFATF will be doing the same thing. So the test, Mr. Speaker, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. The test is what in fact is done. And this is the predicate I say. I am satisfied that in all the experience I have, one, we were motivated in good faith to achieve a strong regulatory regime that withstand any kind of test and any kind of scrutiny. And two, Mr. Speaker, that we would put in place a fair regime of taxation. That we would do no more and no less in terms of our approach for the locals as we would do for the foreigners. And never mind the fact that interactive gaming is 5% for the casinos. I'm not going to get into the billions of dollars that they have represented. We've just had an experience upfront and personal and detailed with Brooksfield, the owners of Atlantis, going through refinancing, and where the government of the Bahamas had to get involved in that. to make concessions in that. So we know, Mr. Speaker, the difficulty. We are competent in being able to understand that, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, we are providing the people of this country with a regime that at the end of all of the process, all of the debate, all of the discussion, Mr. Speaker, will be seen by countries abroad and followed. That's what we're doing. And, Mr. Speaker, as we are now at the luncheon hour, I just want to leave this proposition. We continue to be responsive, Mr. Speaker, to any recommendations that are made. I think it was a member from Fort Charlotte who made a point to the minister responsible for gaming with respect to servers being left out of the regulations. No problem. Even though there was an interpretation under the word maintenance that in itself meant, from a legal point of view, service, we will put the word service in because we are responsive to persons who would help us bring about a regime that we can, in fact, feel good about. That's what it's about. And to my friends, Mr. Speaker, I remember when Brother Stewart used to pray for me and my then law partner.
He praying for something else now.
My law partner. But he taught me in the prayer. He's a teacher. He taught me in the prayer, Mr. Speaker, the personal responsibility of Christian living. And so when I spoke to that, whether it was Billy Graham or Alfred Stewart or Lyle Bethel, their assignment is to create an environment for us where we can live with each other peacefully, do the right thing. They must also allow for the fact that though they may not have been in that room with all of the other church leaders, they must allow for the fact, Mr. Speaker, that when you start an action that can be described as political, you are then going into an arena that's going to prove to be very difficult, as you've heard from the Member of Parliament for Baines and Grandstown. And so I happen to have a relationship, and when I was interviewed, I said that with both of them. I have no difficulty whatsoever with anybody being critical of me, Mr. Speaker. That is their right. Just let me be able to respond to say, you're wrong. I have not committed a sin. I never intended to be sinful. I'm doing this in the paramount interest of the Bahamian people, and ultimately I'm serving their interests. Nothing more, nothing less. That's the intention, Mr. Speaker. I rest.
The chair understands.
I'm continuing, Mr. Speaker.
The right honourable member pauses. It's understood. There's a tradition in the wrap-up in every debate. Honourable members, there's a tradition in the wrap-up of a debate that the member speaks for as long as he wishes.
Yes.
The chair recognizes the honourable member for Bain and Grandstand.
Speaker, I move the House suspend until 3 p.m. this afternoon.
It's moved and seconded that the business of this House suspends until 3 p.m. this afternoon. As many as are in favor will remain seated. Those opposed will stand. The business of this House suspends until 3 p.m. this afternoon.